getting very close to the moon was very impressive in many ways, but the moon is nothing compared to our home planet.
Before he passed, Michael Collins revealed what really happened during Apollo 11. And he had been protecting that truth for 50 years, not from embarrassment, not from modesty, from something far heavier. The knowledge that on the most celebrated day in human history, he had been given a set of instructions so terrible that NASA kept them classified for decades. Nixon had a eulogy pre-written, and Collins was quietly prepared to execute them alone. He orbited the moon, while Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface.
Collins remained in the Apollo command module, orbiting the moon. Not the best seat on this mission, but not something he regretted.
And nobody, not the public, not the press, not the people cheering at Mission Control, knew what was sitting in his pocket. This is what he finally admitted before he died. The man who was left behind. Here's what the history books skip. Collins almost didn't make it to Apollo 11 at all. In 1968, he was removed from the prime crew of Apollo 8, the first manned mission to orbit the moon. After developing a cervical disc herniation, a serious spinal condition that required surgery and months of recovery, he watched from the ground as Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders flew the mission he had trained for, with no certainty he would ever fly again. That injury didn't just sideline him, it haunted him. Every astronaut understood the math. The program wasn't infinite, the slots weren't unlimited, and the window for a moon mission was already narrowing. Collins spent that recovery period watching the program move without him, wondering if his moment had already passed. He got his chance when he was assigned to Apollo 11 as command module pilot, responsible for flying the spacecraft to and from the moon and maintaining Columbia in lunar orbit, while Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface. It was not the most celebrated assignment. The command module pilot would not walk on the moon, would not plant the flag, would not be the face on the front page. But it was arguably the most technically precise position on the crew, because if the lunar module failed, Collins had to attempt rescue. And if rescue was impossible, Collins had to make the decision no mission briefing document ever quite prepared a person for. He accepted the role. He trained for both outcomes. But what he didn't talk about publicly for 5 decades was what that second outcome actually required him to hold. And that is where this story really begins. If you want to understand what NASA never fully told the public about Apollo 11, stay with this video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because this channel goes exactly where the official record doesn't. The weight of isolation. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center, watched by over 1 million people, and broadcast live worldwide. Collins later described the launch as surprisingly smooth, less violent than he had expected, though the raw power was undeniable. And then, almost suddenly, they were in the silence of space. 3 days later, they were in lunar orbit. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module Eagle, sealed the hatch, and began their descent toward the surface. And Collins was left alone. He circled the moon every 2 hours. 48 minutes of each orbit passed in complete radio silence. No Earth, no Armstrong, no Aldrin, no Mission Control. As Columbia slipped behind the moon, where no signal could penetrate, 48 minutes of knowing nothing, every single pass. The conventional story treats this as peaceful, almost poetic, and Collins played along with that version for decades, talking in interviews about the beauty of the cratered surface below, the alien stillness, the sense of vast perspective. Here's what he admitted in his final years. That version was not the truth. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the most psychologically brutal experience of his life. Here is what a 48-minute blackout actually felt like, from inside. Columbia. Crosses the lunar limb, and in the space of a second, every signal dies. No telemetry from Earth, no voice from Mission Control, no contact with Armstrong and Aldrin, wherever they are below. Just the hum of the spacecraft systems and the absolute total certainty that Collins is the only human being in the universe who cannot be reached. He runs the checklists, he performs the systems checks. He keeps his hands moving, because sitting still with the full weight of what was in that document in his pocket was something he could not afford to do. Not up here, not now. He had to be functional when the radio came back. and the radio would come back. That was the thing he held onto during every blackout. The radio would come back, and either Armstrong would report that Eagle had landed, or there would be something in the silence that told Collins what had happened, and he would know what came next. The document. Here's where it gets dark. NASA had developed contingency plans for every conceivable failure. One of them, classified, not publicized for years, addressed the scenario where the lunar module ascent engine failed, leaving Armstrong and Aldrin alive on the surface, but with no way back to orbit. In that scenario, Collins' orders were precise: continue orbiting, maintain communication with the stranded crew for as long as possible. Several passes, enough time for final messages, for goodbyes, and then fire Columbia's engine, break out of lunar orbit, and begin the 3-day journey back to Earth alone. He would leave them there, alive until the oxygen ran out. Think about that for a moment. Not the mission failing, not a catastrophic explosion. Armstrong and Aldrin alive on the surface, able to communicate, able to hear Collins' voice, and Collins methodically executing the return burn anyway, because there was nothing else to do. The mission parameters were clear. Rescue was not possible. Remaining in orbit indefinitely was not possible. The math was brutal, and the outcome was fixed. Collins had been briefed on this. He had rehearsed the burn calculations. He had memorized the undocking procedures for separating from a lunar module that would never be coming with him. He had practiced the exact sequence he would need to execute with hands that would be shaking, under a timeline that allowed no margin for hesitation. And before the mission launched, he had been given a copy of the statement that President Nixon had prepared to read to the nation if it came to that. Get this. A sitting president had written the eulogy before the mission even left Earth. Collins read it once. He committed it to memory. And then he folded it and put it away. Because there was nothing useful to be done with it except carry it. The statement began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." Read that again. The White House had already written the ending, before the story had started. Nixon's speechwriter had already composed the words that would make Armstrong and Aldrin's deaths permanent and official. Collins had read those words. He had held them in his hands. And then he flew to the moon, with that knowledge sitting in his chest like a stone. In his final interviews before his death in 2021, Collins was asked what it was like to carry that document. He said he didn't talk about it for 50 years because there was no version of explaining it that didn't sound like something from a nightmare. You can't describe being handed a president's eulogy for your crewmates and then shaking hands and climbing into the rocket with them. There are no good words for that. But here's the thing, nobody expected. That wasn't the worst part. 30 seconds of fuel. Collins listened to the landing sequence transmission with a specific kind of dread. Not the abstract fear of danger, but the focused technical dread of a man who knows exactly what failure looks like and is listening for it. The 1202 alarm sounded repeatedly during the descent. A computer error. Nobody at mission control, and nobody inside the spacecraft, fully understood what it meant in real time. They knew it wasn't immediately catastrophic. They didn't know if it was the start of something that was. Collins, listening from orbit, heard the hesitation in the voices, the split-second pauses before responses, the controlled tension of people who were managing something they hadn't fully anticipated. And this is where it gets dark. Every time that alarm sounded, Collins was running his own parallel calculation, not the landing, the abort. If Eagle had to scrub the descent and fire the ascent engine from altitude, what would the rendezvous look like? How fast could he close? What was the window? He was computing the rescue even as he was hoping the rescue would never be necessary, because that was his job. That was what being command module pilot actually meant in the hours that counted. And here's what nobody tells you. Collins was on the far side of the moon when Eagle actually touched down. Armstrong had taken manual control of the lunar module and was flying it horizontally across the surface, searching for any flat place to land, while the fuel gauges dropped past critical levels. He set Eagle down with less than 30 seconds of propellant remaining. 28 seconds by some accounts. If he hadn't found that spot when he did, the computer would have automatically aborted and the ascent engine would have fired. One shot, one chance to reach Collins in orbit, one chance before the contingency became real. Collins was in radio blackout for all of it, He came back around the moon and heard mission control report that Eagle had landed. He heard the numbers, he heard the confirmation, and the relief. He said in 2019, 50 years later, was not just relief that they had landed. It was relief that the ascent stage was intact, that they still had the capability to get back up to him, that the document in his pocket was still, for now, a worst-case scenario and not an instruction. He still had no idea how close it had been. Maximum anxiety. Here's what the moonwalk looked like from orbit. While Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface, moving through the photographs and the flag planting and the moments that would become the defining images of the 20th century, Collins was in the command module reviewing emergency rendezvous procedures, checking systems, watching the mission clock with an intensity that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with arithmetic. Every minute they were outside was a minute where a suit seal could fail, where equipment could malfunction, where a dozen different failure modes could activate, and Collins could do nothing about any of them. He could only track the timeline, verify his systems, and be ready. The public experienced the moonwalk as the apex, the culmination, the payoff of everything that had come before. Collins experienced it as the period of maximum exposure. His crewmates were outside, beyond any protection he could provide, and the only thing that would end his anxiety was the moment they sealed the hatch behind them and began the launch sequence. When Armstrong finally reported that they were back inside Eagle, that the cabin was pressurized, that they were preparing for ascent, Collins said the relief that moved through him was physical, but he didn't let himself feel it fully, not yet. Because the ascent engine still had to fire, had to separate from the descent stage cleanly, had to hit the precise vector that would bring them to him. There was still the last, most terrifying moment left. The sound. The ascent stage fired, Eagle climbed, Collins acquired them on radar, a single point of light moving against the black, and began the rendezvous sequence. Hours of precise burns, small corrections. Each thruster firing calculated and controlled, narrowing the distance meter by meter until Columbia and Eagle were close enough to see each other through the window. And then the docking. The moment when the two spacecraft came together and the mechanism locked, that mechanical thunk, sudden and solid and certain. Collins would later say was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. Not metaphorically, physically. The sound of the lock engaging was the sound of the contingency dying. It was the sound of the document in his pocket becoming history instead of instruction. He said nothing on the radio for a moment. Just let it happen. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back through the docking tunnel with the lunar samples and the film. They jettisoned Eagle. Collins fired Columbia's engine, and they began the 3-day journey home. But here's the catch. He still didn't fully exhale. The return engine could fail. The heat shield could fail during re-entry. The parachutes could fail. Collins had been trained to identify every point of failure between here and the Pacific Ocean, and his nervous system wouldn't stop running the list. Only when they splashed down on July 24th, when he could see the helicopters, when he could see the USS Hornet on the horizon, did the tension he had carried for 8 days finally release. In the privacy of his spacecraft, before the recovery divers reached them, Collins wept. The world was celebrating. Mission Control was cheering, and Collins was alone with the knowledge of what he had been prepared to do, and the almost unbearable gratitude that he hadn't had to do it. What he finally said. For decades after Apollo 11, Collins gave thousands of interviews. He was charming, self-deprecating. He made jokes about being the forgotten astronaut. He cultivated the graceful narrative of a man entirely at peace with his secondary role. Here's what nobody knew. It was a performance, not dishonest, but incomplete. He watched Armstrong retreat from public life, clearly unable to carry the weight of being a living monument. A man who had walked on the moon and found that history would never let him be anything else. He watched Aldrin struggle publicly with depression and alcoholism, wrestling with the question of what a life means after you've done the only thing history will remember you for at the age of 39. The achievement that should have been a beginning had, for both of them, become a ceiling. Collins left NASA in 1970, less than a year after the mission, and built a quieter existence. The National Air and Space Museum, writing distance from the machinery of celebrity. He said more than once that the mission's fame had cost his crewmates something essential, that there is a particular cruelty in being defined entirely by a single moment, no matter how extraordinary that moment was. He admitted that being forgotten was a gift. The burden was real. His name unremembered, his role reduced to a footnote. But the gift was that he was never required to become a symbol. He could remain simply a person. The forgetting had given him something Armstrong and Aldrin never fully recovered, a life that belonged to him. In his final years, particularly in interviews around the 50th anniversary in 2019, and in his last public statements before his death on April 28, 2021, Collins began to say the things he had kept back. He admitted the fear, the isolation, the weight of the contingency, the relief so profound it was almost painful. He said the mission succeeded as much through luck and improvisation as through preparation, that nobody really knew what was happening during the 1202 alarm sequence, that Armstrong's manual landing was a desperate search for any flat ground before the fuel ran out, and that if any one of a dozen small variables had shifted, he would have come home alone. He was not trying to diminish Apollo 11. He said that clearly. He was trying to make it real again, to restore it from monument back to moment, a moment when ordinary people did something extraordinary while terrified, improvised when the plan failed, and carried psychological weight that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. He wanted the mission understood as human, not mythological, because the human version, he said, was the one that actually mattered. The truth he carried. Michael Collins died on April 28, 2021, at the age of 90 after a battle with cancer. The tributes that followed were generous and long overdue, finally giving Collins the credit that 5 decades of being the third astronaut had deferred. But even those tributes could not fully account for what he had admitted in his final years, that his experience of Apollo 11 was defined not by what he did, but by what he was prepared to do, that his greatest fear was not death, but survival, that the mission's success meant not just that humans had walked on the moon, but that he had not been required to leave anyone behind. He listened to transmissions from the surface knowing that any crackle of static could be the last signal he ever received from his crewmates. He rehearsed, in the silence of each blackout pass, what he would say to their widows. He carried a president's eulogy in his pocket for 8 days and brought it home unused. And when that docking mechanism locked, when the most beautiful sound he had ever heard told him Armstrong and Aldrin were coming back, he allowed himself, finally, to break, briefly, privately, before the world came back in. That is what Michael Collins revealed before he passed. Not a conspiracy, not a scandal. Something quieter and more devastating than either. The truth that the most triumphant moment in human history was, for the man who made it possible, the longest experience of controlled terror ever endured in silence. The official story of Apollo 11 was always the story of what went right. Collins gave us the story of what almost went wrong, and of the man who had been trained, prepared, and quietly resigned to carry the worst version of that story home if he had to. He was ready. He had read the eulogy. He had run the numbers. He just never had to use them. And for 50 years, he kept that to himself, because there was no place in the triumphant version of history for the weight of what he had been holding. The forgotten astronaut orbited alone so that the others could walk. He came home with his crew. He kept the document in his pocket and never had to use it. That was his victory. That was the story he finally told. If this gave you a new understanding of Apollo 11, subscribe, because there are stories like this one still waiting to be told, and this channel is going to tell them.